The evening was cooler than usual, a light breeze rustling the leaves as people made their way down the busy street. Cars honked in the distance, their lights glowing brightly as they sped through the city. A woman wrapped in a simple jacket walked steadily along the sidewalk. She had just finished her shift at the local hospital, where she spent hours on her feet, tending to patients who were often too sick to fend for themselves. Her day had been long, but there was a sense of calm that came with. As she made her way toward her apartment, she wasn't paying much attention to her surroundings. It was a well-lit area, and she had walked these streets countless times. But today something was different. She noticed a police car pulling over to the side of the street, the flashing lights making the air feel suddenly heavy. She didn't think much of it at first. There were police around this part of town all the time. But then the car made a sharp U-turn and headed straight for her. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized they were stopping right next to her. The officer inside the vehicle rolled down the window and waved for her to stop. She froze for a moment, not sure what was happening. She had no reason to fear the police, but there was something about the way the officer looked at her that made her uneasy. It wasn't the first time she had experienced this kind of suspicion, but it always made her wonder what people saw when they looked at her. She had spent years working hard, earning respect, and proving her worth in a world that often didn't give people like her a fair shot. Yet here she was, unsure of what was about to unfold. As the officer stepped out of the car, he approached her, his eyes narrowing slightly. She could feel the tension in the air, something unspoken between them. "What are you doing here?" he asked sharply. She straightened her back, trying to hide the sudden wave of anxiety creeping up her spine. "I'm just walking home after work." The officer looked her up and down as if inspecting her every move. She noticed the way his eyes lingered on her, his body language shifting. It was the kind of look that made her feel small, even though she had every right to be there. He didn't speak for a moment, his expression hardening. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, his voice carrying a tone that felt accusatory rather than curious. She frowned, taken aback. "I live here. I've been walking these streets for years." The officer didn't seem convinced. He reached for his radio, speaking quickly into the mic. She couldn't make out the words, but she could feel his eyes on her the whole time. Something was off. She stood still, her pulse quickening. Why was this happening? She had done nothing wrong. Still, she remained calm, trying to steady her nerves. The officer returned to her after a few moments, his expression shifting slightly. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for. Stay right here." She blinked in confusion. "What do you mean?" "I'm just heading home." The officer ignored her and turned to walk back toward his patrol car, leaving her standing there, confused and increasingly uncomfortable. She took a deep breath, trying to process what was happening. As she stood there, a sharp voice cut through the night air, louder than the sound of the passing cars. "What's going on?" The voice came from a man who had appeared out of nowhere. She recognized him immediately as one of her colleagues from the police department. He was a senior officer, a figure of authority who had earned respect through years of service. He had been in the force for much longer than her, and she had always looked up to him. The officer who had initially stopped her turned toward the sound of the voice, his face paling slightly. The realization hit him before he could even respond. "Is there a problem here?" the senior officer asked, his tone now authoritative, demanding answers. The woman standing on the sidewalk took a deep breath, trying to process what was happening. Was this man truly questioning her like this? She could see the officer's posture shift. He no longer stood with the same aggressive stance. His expression softened and his gaze turned to the ground as if he were ashamed. She wasn't sure what had changed, but it was as though the air itself had shifted. For a long moment, there was silence. The senior officer turned his gaze to her, a silent question in his eyes. She hesitated for a moment, then spoke quietly. "I was just heading home after work when I was stopped by this officer. He said I fit a description, but I haven't done anything wrong." The senior officer's gaze shifted to the officer who had stopped her. The tension between them was palpable. He had obviously recognized the mistake. The officer who had stopped her seemed to shrink under the scrutiny. He avoided eye contact and muttered something inaudible. The woman stood there, unsure of what to say or do next. Her heart was still racing from the shock of the interaction. After a few moments, the senior officer looked back at her, his tone softer now. "You're all right. There's no need for this to go any further." She nodded slowly, still trying to process everything that had just happened. She had been stopped, accused without reason, and treated like a criminal, all for no apparent reason other than her appearance. The officer who had made the mistake stepped back, his face flushed with embarrassment. He stammered out an apology, but it felt hollow. The damage had been done. The woman didn't want to hear it. She didn't need to hear it. As she turned to walk away, she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. It wasn't just the physical discomfort of the situation. It was the feeling of being judged before even having a chance to explain herself. The officer's actions had been motivated by something deeper, something that had nothing to do with her actions or character. She walked away from the scene, her mind racing with thoughts and emotions. Why had this happened? Was it because of who she was? Did he see her as a threat because of her skin color? Or was it just another example of someone in power misusing that power? Her steps were steady, but inside she was anything but calm. This was the kind of thing she had seen happen to others before. She had witnessed the prejudices in the world and knew the struggles that came with being a person of color, in a position of authority. She had worked so hard to rise above it, to prove herself capable not just to her colleagues but to society as a whole. But today, it felt like none of that mattered. She had been reduced to nothing more than the color of her skin, a stereotype that had nothing to do with who she truly was. The injustice of it hit her harder than she cared to admit. As she walked through the streets, the cool breeze blowing against her face, she couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if the senior officer hadn't shown up. Would the situation have escalated further? Would she have been treated as just another target of prejudice, left to fend for herself in a world that often didn't seem to care? The thought lingered in her mind, but she pushed it aside. She had to keep going, had to keep moving forward. She couldn't let this one moment define her. She couldn't let it take away the progress she had made. Her heart was still heavy, but she knew this wasn't the end of the story. It couldn't be. She would make sure of that. The following morning was filled with the same hustle and bustle of the city, yet for the woman, everything felt different. The events of the previous evening replayed in her mind on a constant loop. She had tried to go to sleep and push it all aside, but it was impossible. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling of being treated as if she was less than, treated like an outsider, even though she belonged just as much as anyone else. She had worked tirelessly to earn her place, yet, as she made her way to her office that morning, the air felt heavier than usual. The streets that she had walked down so many times before now seemed foreign, filled with a palpable tension. She walked into her department's building, trying to keep her emotions in check. She had spent hours thinking about what had happened, and all of it led her to the same conclusion. She couldn't ignore the situation. It was clear that the problem went far beyond that one interaction, and it was time to address it. The woman made her way to her desk, where her colleagues were already working. Some of them greeted her with a polite nod, while others seemed unaware of what had happened the night before, but there were a few who had heard the whispers. She noticed the way some of them avoided eye contact, and it didn't take long for her to realize they were talking about her. She tried to focus on her work, but the tension in the air was undeniable. It was clear that the news of the altercation had spread. She sat down at her desk, staring at the stack of papers in front of her. As her hand reached for her coffee, she noticed a figure standing by her office door. It was the senior officer, the one who had intervened last night. His presence alone was enough to make her feel uneasy, though she couldn't quite pinpoint why. There was a strange mix of respect and guilt in his eyes as he stepped inside. "Morning," he said softly, his voice carrying a tone that seemed different from the night before. She nodded, barely meeting his gaze. "Morning." There was an awkward pause, and she could tell that he wasn't sure how to approach the conversation. After a few moments, he finally spoke again. "I've been thinking a lot about last night. I want to apologize again for what happened. You didn't deserve that." The woman felt a wave of frustration building inside her, but she kept her expression neutral. "It wasn't just about me. You know that, right? This is bigger than what happened last night." He seemed to hesitate, his expression turning serious. "I know, and I agree. It's a bigger issue than just a bad encounter. We need to address the culture in this department, and we need to make sure something like this doesn't happen again." She looked up at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You really think things are going to change?" He met her gaze, his face softening. "I want to believe they can. I want to help make that change happen, but I know it's not going to be easy. This is a long-standing issue. She sighed, leaning back in her chair. I've worked with people who've been through this kind of thing. I've heard the stories. It's not just one officer. It's the system. The senior officer seemed to take a moment to absorb her words. He nodded slowly. You're right. It's more than just one person. But we have to start somewhere. The woman sat quietly thinking. She knew that things wouldn't change overnight, but the conversation was a start. It was something they could build on. Still, the doubt lingered. Would the department truly make the changes necessary to prevent future incidents, or would it be just another empty promise? The senior officer seemed to sense her uncertainty. I'll make sure your voice is heard, and I'll push for the right changes no matter how difficult it may be. She nodded, though a part of her still didn't believe it was enough. But for now, it was all she could do. I appreciate that, she said quietly, but it was clear she was far from convinced. He gave her a brief nod before leaving her office. She returned her attention to the work in front of her, but her mind was elsewhere. The weight of the situation was heavy on her shoulders, but she refused to back down. This wasn't just about what had happened to her. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to go through the same thing. And as much as she wanted to ignore it, she knew deep down that she couldn't. Not anymore. The day dragged on, each minute feeling like an hour. Every time she tried to focus on the tasks at hand, her thoughts returned to the previous evening. She couldn't forget the way the officer had treated her, how easily he had resorted to violence simply because of who she was. The injustice of it all made her blood boil. How many people had faced the same thing or worse, and not had the opportunity for someone to step in and help? It wasn't just about race either. It was about power and control. It was about a system that had been allowed to perpetuate this kind of behavior for too long. She knew that her own experiences were just one small part of a much larger problem. As the day turned to evening, she left the office with a heavy heart. She walked through the same streets as the night before, the cool breeze now a familiar companion. But there was something different about this walk. She felt as though she was walking toward something, a purpose she hadn't had the day before. She had a mission now. The next few days were a whirlwind. The woman knew that she had to act quickly before the moment faded away. She couldn't let the story of what happened to her be swept under the rug. She had to keep pushing, keep fighting for change. She met with colleagues, both allies and skeptics, trying to rally support for a movement that would address racial profiling, police misconduct, and the deep-rooted issues within the department. It wasn't easy. Some people were too afraid to speak up, while others just didn't see the problem. The resistance was stronger than she had anticipated. But she didn't back down. She filed complaints, wrote reports, and met with higher-ups who promised to listen. The process was slow, frustratingly so, but every conversation, every meeting was a step in the right direction. She refused to let it be in vain. Through all of it, the senior officer remained by her side, offering support where he could. He wasn't the solution, but he was part of it. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like someone was on her side, not just because of who she was, but because of what was right. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was a road she was willing to walk. She couldn't change the past, but she could help shape the future, and she wouldn't stop until she did. The next few weeks were a blur. The woman found herself tangled in endless meetings, discussions, and reports. It seemed like there was always something new to address, but in a way, it gave her a sense of purpose. The fight for change was exhausting, but she knew it was necessary. She was no longer just a victim of a single encounter. She was a part of something much larger. The issue of racial profiling, bias in policing, and the abuse of power within law enforcement had plagued the system for years. She had always known that change was difficult, but nothing could have prepared her for the resistance she faced. She had expected some pushback, but she hadn't anticipated the level of denial. It was as though some people refused to see what was right in front of them. How could they not understand? How could they not see that the system was broken? It wasn't just the officers who had resisted the idea of change. It was the community, too. There were people who simply didn't want to acknowledge the injustices that had been happening for far too long. The woman had tried to explain the need for reform to people who didn't believe there was a problem. They dismissed her, claiming that the system worked just fine, that incidents like the one she had experienced were isolated events, not a reflection of the larger issue. But she refused to back down. Each conversation was a small victory. Even if they didn't agree, she knew she was planting seeds. She couldn't change the world in a day, but she could start by making her voice heard. Every conversation, every meeting was another step in the right direction. At work, things had changed slightly. The atmosphere had become tense, with some people avoiding her, while others began to speak more openly about their own experiences. It wasn't just her now. More and more colleagues were coming forward, sharing their stories and acknowledging the issues that had long been swept under the rug. It wasn't easy for them to speak out. Some feared backlash, others were just scared of rocking the boat. But the conversation had started. That was the most important thing. The senior officer continued to support her through it all. He was one of the few who had been willing to take a stand, to speak out against the injustice. He had pushed for change behind the scenes, working with those in power to initiate some reform. But even with his support, the progress was slow. He had a deep understanding of the way things worked in law enforcement, and while he believed in her mission, he knew that real change was never quick or easy. Still, he didn't give up. Neither did she. The woman found herself thinking a lot about the future. What would it take for things to truly change? She knew it would require a shift in the culture, not just a few policy adjustments. It wasn't enough to change the rules. They needed to change the way people thought, the way they viewed their roles within the system. She thought about the young recruits who joined the force, about the ideals they had when they first started. Were they ready to face the harsh realities of the job? Would they be able to make the right choices when faced with difficult situations? It was a question she asked herself often. She wanted to believe that the next generation could do better. She had to believe that things could change. But every day brought new challenges. One day, after a particularly grueling meeting, she found herself sitting alone in the break room, staring at her cup of coffee. She had just spent an hour talking to a group of officers who seemed to think that racial profiling wasn't a big deal, that it was just a misunderstanding, an isolated incident. She had heard the same excuses 100 times, but this time it hit harder. They didn't see the problem. They couldn't or wouldn't see it. She slammed the cup down on the table, frustrated. How can they not get it? She muttered under her breath. The senior officer walked in, his face creased with concern. He had been watching the conversation from a distance, and he could see the toll it was taking on her. He knew that she had been working hard, that this fight was consuming her. "It's tough," he said softly, sitting across from her. "But you're doing the right thing. You're making them think. Even if they don't show it now, you're planting seeds." She sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I don't know if it's enough." "What if it's all for nothing?" He shook his head. "It's never for nothing. The change may not be immediate, but it's happening. Look at the conversations you've started. Look at the way people are talking now. It's more than we've ever had before." She nodded, but it was hard to feel encouraged. The battle was long, and it felt like every step forward was met with 2 steps back. She had moments of hope, but they were fleeting. The weight of the task ahead seemed insurmountable at times. But she couldn't give up, not now. Not after everything. That night, she sat down at her kitchen table, a pile of reports in front of her. She was working late, trying to find solutions to the issues she had been facing. She knew that the fight wasn't just about changing the rules. It was about changing hearts and minds. It was about confronting the deep-seated biases that shaped the way officers interacted with the community. She thought back to the encounter with the officer who had punched her. It felt like a lifetime ago, yet the memories were still fresh. She remembered the shock she felt when he'd hit her, the disbelief that someone could treat her like that. But she also remembered the moment of realization when he recognized her, when he understood who she was. It was a pivotal moment. It showed her that the problem wasn't just about race. It was about ignorance, about assumptions that were made based on stereotypes. She had learned so much from that experience. She had learned that change could start with a single moment. It didn't matter how small the action seemed. It was the first step that mattered. She knew that if she could change the hearts and minds of just one person, it would be worth it. The next day, she met with more colleagues, working on new strategies to address the issues they had been discussing. They began to brainstorm ideas to think about how they could create real, lasting change. It wasn't easy and there were plenty of setbacks, but they kept moving forward. Every step counted, and as the days went by, she found herself becoming more and more determined. She wasn't going to let the system beat her down. She wasn't going to let the prejudice and ignorance win. She had a mission, and she was going to see it through. The fight for justice was long, but she knew that it was a fight worth having. The road ahead was uncertain, but she was no longer afraid of it. She had faced so much already, and she was still standing, and that, she realized, was the key. No matter how hard it got, no matter how many obstacles were in her way, she would keep fighting. The fight for change had only just begun, and she was ready to lead the charge. As weeks turned into months, the woman's resolve only grew stronger. The push for change wasn't just about one incident anymore. It had become a movement for justice, fairness, and accountability within a system that had long turned a blind eye to the suffering of marginalized communities. She knew it wouldn't be easy, and at times it felt like the weight of the world was pressing down on her shoulders. But with each passing day, she found herself more determined to see this through. The conversations at work had shifted, but not everyone was on board with the changes she was pushing for. Some of her colleagues were still stuck in old ways of thinking. They saw themselves as the protectors of the law, convinced that their actions were always justified no matter the situation. They couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge that the system they were a part of was flawed. The more she spoke out, the more resistance she encountered. Some argued that racism in law enforcement wasn't as widespread as she claimed, that it was merely a few bad apples. Others refused to accept that the department needed to change. There were days when the constant pushback made her question if she was doing the right thing. She felt isolated at times, as though she were fighting a battle alone, but then she would remember the reason she started this journey in the first place. She had a voice. She had the power to change things, even if it took time, and she couldn't let fear or doubt stop her now. One day, after yet another meeting with a group of officers who insisted there was no real issue with the way they operated, the woman walked out of the room feeling defeated. The conversation had gone in circles with no real progress made. As she headed to her office, the weight of the situation pressed down on her. She knew the road to change was going to be long, but sometimes it felt like it was too long, like she was chasing an unreachable goal. But as she walked down the hall, she saw a familiar face. It was the senior officer, the one who had supported her from the very beginning. His expression was serious, but there was a sense of urgency in his eyes that caught her attention. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice low. The woman followed him into a small conference room, her mind racing. She had no idea what this conversation would bring, but she could tell by the look on his face that it was important. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone a little more tense than usual. "I've been speaking with some of the higher-ups," he began, his voice quiet but firm. "And I think we've got a shot at making real change, but it's going to take all of us working together. It's time for a bigger push. I've got some allies who are on board, but we need more." The woman listened intently, her heart picking up speed. This was the moment she had been waiting for. It felt like a turning point, a chance to finally make the kind of impact she had dreamed of. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with determination. He gave her a small smile. "I need you to keep pushing. Keep talking to the people who are still hesitant. We've got to get the rest of the department on board. We can't just talk about change, we need to make it happen." She nodded, the weight of the task settling in. She had been fighting this battle for months, but now it felt like it was finally gaining momentum. It wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like victory was within reach. Over the next few weeks, the woman found herself at the center of a larger movement. She continued to meet with officers, sharing her message of reform and the need for accountability. But this time she wasn't alone. More and more colleagues began to see the truth in her words. Slowly, the department began to shift, though not without its challenges. Some were still resistant, unwilling to let go of old habits and beliefs, but with each conversation, with each meeting, the momentum grew. It wasn't just about changing policies anymore. It was about changing hearts and minds. She began to focus on building relationships, finding common ground with those who were initially opposed to her ideas. She knew that the only way to make real change was to get people to understand why it was necessary. She wasn't asking them to abandon everything they knew. She was asking them to look at things through a different lens, to open their eyes to the realities that so many had ignored for far too long. One day, she sat down with a group of officers who had been vocal in their opposition to her cause. They were tough, no-nonsense individuals who had spent years in the department, and they weren't easily swayed. But as they talked, she could see something shift. They were listening to her, not just hearing her, but truly listening. The conversation wasn't easy, but it was productive. It was the beginning of change. As the weeks passed, more officers began to speak up in support of her efforts. The senior officer remained by her side, offering guidance and support when she needed it most. Together, they began to push for real reform. They proposed changes to training programs, suggesting that officers be taught not only the law but also the importance of empathy, understanding, and cultural awareness. They pushed for better accountability measures, ensuring that officers who violated department policies would be held responsible. But even as the movement gained momentum, there were still setbacks. The political climate within the department remained tense, and some of the higher-ups were still reluctant to fully embrace the changes that were being proposed. There were moments when it felt like all the progress they had made was in jeopardy, but the woman refused to let up. She kept pushing, kept fighting, because she knew that this was the only way to create a future where people like her wouldn't be treated as less than, where everyone, regardless of background, would be treated with dignity and respect. The day finally came when the department made an official announcement. They had listened to the concerns of the officers and the community, and they were implementing changes. It was a victory, but it wasn't the end of the battle. The woman knew that true change would take time, and there would be challenges along the way. But as she stood there listening to the announcement, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They had done it. They had made a difference. But as she left the meeting, she couldn't shake the feeling that the work was far from over. This was just the beginning. There was still so much to be done, so many minds left to change, so many lives to touch. But she was ready. She had fought for this moment. And now it was time to keep fighting. For the future, for the next generation, for everyone who had been overlooked, ignored, or silenced for too long. And as she walked out of the building, the weight on her shoulders felt just a little bit lighter. She had taken a step toward change. But the real journey was only just beginning. The days following the department's announcement felt like a blur. There was a sense of relief, but it wasn't complete. While the change in policy was a victory, the woman knew that it was only the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead. She had spent so long fighting for change, but now she had to ensure that the change was sustainable, that it would become more than just words on paper. She had to make sure that the department, the officers, and the community as a whole would hold each other accountable. The department had made the right promises, but promises were only as good as the people who upheld them. She knew that there was still a long road ahead, one filled with resistance, doubt, and setbacks. But there was a fire inside her now, one that she couldn't ignore. It was a fire that burned with a desire to make a difference, to create lasting change that would benefit everyone, not just a few. In the weeks that followed, the woman continued to meet with colleagues, supervisors, and community leaders. She shared her vision for the future of the department and how they could all work together to build a stronger, more inclusive environment. It wasn't easy. There were still those who resisted the changes, but more and more people began to listen. Conversations that had once been hostile became more thoughtful, and that made all the difference. It wasn't just about changing the policies. It was about changing hearts and minds. She focused on engaging those who were still on the fence, those who hadn't yet seen the importance of the changes that were being made. She wasn't trying to convince everyone to agree with her, but she wanted them to understand why it was necessary, to open their eyes to the challenges that people from marginalized communities faced every day. At times, the resistance felt overwhelming. There were moments when it seemed like the forces of change would be swept away by the sheer weight of tradition and prejudice. But each time she felt discouraged, she would think about the people who had stood by her, the ones who had supported her from the very beginning. She would think about the officers who were beginning to speak up, who were willing to challenge the status quo. It wasn't easy for them, and it wasn't easy for her, but together they were making progress. One afternoon, after another tough meeting, the woman found herself standing outside the department building, taking a deep breath. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the city, and for a moment she felt a sense of peace. It had been a long day, and her mind was racing with thoughts of the future. She knew that she had done everything she could, but she also knew that the real work was just beginning. The change they had fought for was happening, but it had to be nurtured, cared for, and protected. She was interrupted by a voice calling her name. She turned around to see the senior officer walking toward her. His face was tired, but there was a sense of hope in his eyes. They had come a long way, and she could see the pride in his expression. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice gentle. The woman smiled faintly. "I'm exhausted. But it's a good kind of exhaustion. We've made progress," he nodded. "We've made a lot of progress. But the real work begins now." She looked at him, her gaze steady. "I know it's going to be hard, but we can do this. We have to keep pushing forward." "We will," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "But we're not alone anymore. There are more of us now, and together we'll make sure this change sticks." The woman nodded, a sense of resolve filling her chest. She had always known that change would take time, but now she believed that it was possible. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be setbacks along the way. But they had made it this far, and they weren't about to stop now. As the days went on, the department continued to make strides toward improvement. The new policies were being implemented, and the training programs were beginning to reflect the values of empathy, understanding, and accountability that had been so desperately needed. But it wasn't just about the policies, it was about the people. It was about creating a culture where officers held themselves accountable, where they saw their role not just as law enforcers, but as members of a community. The woman knew that this wouldn't be a quick fix. There would still be challenges ahead, still moments of doubt, still moments when it seemed like the change wasn't enough. But she also knew that it was possible. She had seen it firsthand, the power of collective action, the impact of standing together for what was right, and she wasn't going to stop. She couldn't. For all the setbacks, the frustrations, and the resistance, there was something bigger at stake. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the future. For a generation of officers who would be better equipped to serve their communities. For a world where no one would have to fear being treated unfairly because of the color of their skin, their gender, or their background. That night, as the woman sat at her desk, she thought back to where it all began, to the night that changed everything. The night she had been confronted by the officer who had punched her. She remembered the shock, the disbelief, the anger, but she also remembered the moment of realization when he had recognized her, when he had understood who she was. It had been a turning point not just for him but for her as well. It had shown her that change was possible, even in the most unexpected places. She thought about the future, about the work that still lay ahead. She knew that there would be more battles to fight, more obstacles to overcome, but she also knew that she was no longer alone in this fight. She had a team behind her, people who believed in what she was doing, who shared her vision for a better future, and together they would continue to push for change, to challenge the status quo, to make the world a better place for everyone. The road ahead was long, but it was a road worth walking. And as the woman looked out of her office window, watching the city lights flicker on, she felt a sense of peace. She had come so far, and though the journey wasn't over, she knew that she had made a difference. And that, she realized, was enough for now. She wasn't just fighting for change, she was fighting for a better future. And as long as she had breath in her body, she would keep fighting. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The woman continued to push forward, but there was no denying that the battle had taken its toll. It was not just about policy changes anymore. It was about the culture, the way people thought, the deep-seated biases they held, and how those biases influenced their actions. The real work was in changing the hearts and minds of people who had been conditioned to see the world through a narrow lens, one that didn't always allow for empathy or understanding. She had learned early on that real change didn't happen overnight. It wasn't a quick fix that could be solved with one policy change or one meeting. It was a long, difficult process, one that required patience, understanding, and a willingness to listen. But it was a process she was committed to, no matter how exhausting it became. One of the toughest challenges she faced was trying to get those who had resisted change to see things from a different perspective. There were still many officers who felt that what they had always done was right. They didn't see the problem, and they didn't want to change. It was hard to break through that wall of resistance. They had spent years in a system that didn't challenge them to think about their biases. And now the woman was asking them to reconsider everything they thought they knew. But she knew she couldn't give up. She had made a commitment to herself, to the department, and to the community. She had to keep going, even when it felt like the weight of the world was on her shoulders. She had to keep having those difficult conversations, keep pushing for accountability, keep calling out injustice, even when it felt like no one was listening. One day, After a particularly tough meeting with a group of officers who had shown no interest in changing their views, the woman sat down at her desk feeling defeated. She was tired, mentally and physically exhausted. The constant resistance, the ongoing battles, it felt like they were never going to end. She knew that the work she was doing was important, but some days it felt like an uphill climb with no end in sight. As she sat there, lost in thought, there was a knock on her door. She looked up to see the senior officer standing in the doorway. His expression was serious, but there was something else in his eyes, a glimmer of hope, perhaps. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. "What's on your mind?" he asked, sitting down across from her. The woman let out a long breath. "I don't know anymore. It's just so hard. It feels like we're not making any progress. No matter how much I push, some people just don't want to change." The senior officer nodded, understanding. Change is always hard, especially when people are so entrenched in their ways. But that doesn't mean it's not possible. We're getting there, step by step. Every conversation you have, every time you challenge someone's thinking, it's a step in the right direction. She looked at him, her eyes tired but resolute. "I just wish it was happening faster. I wish more people were listening." "They will," he said. "It's going to take time. But the fact that you're still here, still pushing, that's what matters. You've already made a difference, and you're going to keep making a difference even when it feels like you're not." His words gave her some comfort, but they didn't completely erase the doubts she was feeling. She knew he was right. She had to keep pushing, but it didn't make the struggle any easier. Over the next few weeks, the woman continued to work tirelessly, attending meetings, having difficult conversations, and pushing for the changes she believed in. She met with community leaders, spoke with officers who were still resistant, and worked on refining the new policies that had been put into place. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was necessary work. The real change wasn't in the headlines. It was in the small, everyday actions that were slowly but surely shifting the culture of the department. One of the more encouraging signs was that more officers were beginning to come to her, asking questions, seeking advice on how they could improve their own practices. It wasn't a lot, but it was a start. The department was slowly beginning to realize that they couldn't continue to operate the way they always had. The old ways weren't working, and the time for change was long overdue. But even as the department moved forward, there were still moments of doubt. The woman had been working tirelessly for months, but there were still those who refused to see the need for change. There were still officers who didn't think that racism existed in their department, who believed that the old system was just fine, and the community wasn't always receptive either. There were still people who didn't trust the police, who believed that the system was broken beyond repair. It was hard not to feel discouraged. There were days when it seemed like all the progress they had made could be undone with one careless action, one bad decision. But then she would remind herself of how far they had come. She would remind herself of the conversations that had shifted, the people who had begun to change their minds, the policies that had been enacted. Change was happening, even if it wasn't happening as quickly as she wanted it to. And as she sat in her office one evening, looking out at the city below, she realized something important. She realized that change wasn't just about the policies. It wasn't just about the department. It was about the people. It was about the connections that had been made, the bridges that had been built. It was about the trust that had begun to form, the understanding that was slowly taking root. It wasn't perfect. There were still challenges ahead, and there would always be people who resisted change. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like they were on the right path. She felt like they were heading in the right direction, and that was enough to keep her going. The next day, the woman stood before a group of officers in a training session. It was a new initiative, one designed to help them understand the impact of bias in policing and how they could better serve their communities. She was nervous, but she knew this was important. This was the kind of change that would make a real difference. As she spoke, she looked out at the officers in front of her. Some of them were skeptical, others were engaged, but all of them were listening, and that, she realized, was the first step. As long as they were listening, there was hope. After the session, one of the officers approached her. He had been quiet throughout the presentation, but now he had a question. "Do you really think things can change?" he asked. The woman smiled, a hint of hope in her eyes. "I do, but it's going to take all of us. We have to work together." He nodded, seeming to understand. It wasn't much, but it was a start. and for the first time in a long time, she felt like the work she had been doing was finally starting to pay off. The road ahead would still be challenging, but the woman knew she wasn't alone. She had a team of people who believed in the same vision, who were working alongside her to make the world a better place. Together, they could make a difference. And no matter how long it took, she was ready to keep fighting for the change that was so desperately needed.